Yeah, that's great. All right. We're seeing your thing in reverse. There you go. Perfect.
Awesome. All right.
That looks really good. So, you guys today in class, as you can see, that's Dr. Bill Campbell. Um, Bill and I have been friends for years, and we've crossed over in different paths of uh, basically speaking at conferences and being involved in different areas like NSCA and the ISSN over many, many years. And then we share students quite a bit, where we've had undergraduates from our group go to him. We've had master's students from his group come up here for PhDs and kind of everything in between. And Bill's an excellent resource, an excellent educator, and a great researcher as well. And Bill, we've had these conversations over the years, but the way he conducts his work is all top notch. And what he does with these diet break types of work and his total lab is focused on like basically body composition, and particularly in like female physique competitors. At least that's how it started off. I'm sure we'll get more of the story today. But Bill, I've been wanting to have you on this class for a long time. We get really, really great people, and we've never synced up for this, so it's great to have Bill on today. Bill, if you could just take us through a short background and then go through your slide deck. We'll take some questions. He has another meeting to get to, so we'll try to wrap up around 10:45. But Bill, take it away.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you for the introduction. Yeah, I have a meeting at 11 that I'm not completely prepared for yet. So I'll make sure I'm done by about a quarter of it's my research team meeting. Just a brief background. I didn't come through academia right from undergrad, worked in sales and marketing for a few years and essentially did a career change. So I was a personal trainer for many years, so I come at this from a practitioner standpoint. And in my late 20s, made the change to, hey, I want to be a scientist, and best decision I've ever made. Importantly, I view my work, my research is serving the practitioners in our field. I don't really I don't really have a high regard for a lot of PhDs. They feel like they know everything, and I don't like that. So I do not conduct my research to serve other researchers. I conduct my work to serve the personal trainers, the weight loss coaches, the practitioners. Now, I do respect PhDs because they're the ones doing the hard, thankless work. But I again, I approach my work differently, or what motivates me is different than a lot of other PhDs. Um, and Dr. Ormsby and I have talked many times. We like to educate. We like to not talk over people's heads. Um, and my research, again, it speaks to everyday problems. So I'm a fat loss researcher. It's what I love doing. I believe that God created me to do this. I come from an obese family, so everybody in my immediate family is obese. I used to bodybuild when I was younger, so just everything about my upbringing. When I was a baby, the doctor told my mom, "You have to stop feeding this baby," because I was literally off the charts with my weight. So I was getting fed too much, whatever she was feeding me. I don't know, buffalo wings or whatever it was as an infant. So fat loss, body composition, building muscle, it is in my DNA. I love the research, I love the science, and I love helping other people. So what we're going to talk about today is something that's well known in bodybuilding circles, but it is not well known in the general dieting realm. So the context here is diet breaks. And this is a quick overview, so I'm going to define it. And the science, I like to call it diet breaks. That's what practitioners call it. In the research literature, if you want to go into more details on this, this will often be described as non-linear dieting, or probably even more commonly than that, intermittent energy restriction. So that's what the scientists call it. Those in the field call it breaks, taking a break from a diet. And what this concept is essentially going against traditional dieting, in the sense that when most people go on a diet, they will diet for 2, 3, 5, 8, whatever months in a row, and they just don't stop. There is never a break from the diet. And this has to do with, at least in some of the original scientific work in this area, the idea was if we can take breaks from dieting, essentially, and I'm going to use my language here, essentially that may help reset one's physiology so that when they go back on a diet, they'll be more responsive. So it's resetting the sensitivity of the fat loss response to a caloric deficit. Now, this is all theoretical, but this is how some of the studies, at least one of the main studies that I'm going to talk about, that was the purpose or the rationale for them using a diet break approach. And the other concept here is adaptive thermogenesis. So that's just a fancy word for saying that as we diet for long periods of time, our bodies become less and less responsive to the caloric deficit. And usually this is tied to one's resting metabolic rate or their metabolism basal metabolic rate. So one thing I want to share on this concept is when somebody loses weight, it is natural and expected that their metabolic rate will go down. That happens. If you have a smaller mass, your metabolism will go down. But the concept of adaptive thermogenesis is that your metabolism, your resting metabolic rate, will go down more than what is expected from weight loss alone. So you'll see here on my slide, I kind of used red font to describe, yes, you lose weight, metabolism goes down, but if it goes down more than what we think, or more than what it should with just weight loss alone, that's something called adaptive thermogenesis. So there was another rationale for some of the scientific work that's been done was to prevent this occurrence for people who are dieting. Now, I also want to say that adaptive thermogenesis is not, there's not a consensus that this occurs in people who diet. A lot of bodybuilders assume it happens. I used to think, yeah, I think it's a real thing. Now I'm not so sure, and I'll share as we go through this. I'll share some of my thoughts on what I think is happening on and why people may not lose weight. But we can all agree, if even in a fitness routine, if I start a fitness routine, I'm going to get better results early on than if I keep doing it over and over. Same thing with dieting. I will lose more weight in the first month than I will in month 8. So this is not a controversial concept, but the extent to which it exists has not been defined. At least there's not a consensus around that definition. So here's an example of, and this is an amplified example for me to make my point, but this is what happens when somebody goes on a diet. And here I just have it a month. First week, they lose a lot more fat, then less fat, then less fat, then less fat. And this is what we typically see. The question is why? Why does this exist? Is it because of metabolic adaptation? If it is because of that, then diet breaks may help alleviate this and give us what I call, this would be like dieting in heaven. Dieting in heaven is I have the same caloric deficit. Let's say I reduce my calories by 20%. And I never have any type of plateau. I lose a lot of fat the first week, the same amount the second, the same amount the third. Now, I will tell you, this is not reality. It does not work like this, but this is what the ideal is. So I'm going to get into just giving you the 4 highlight studies. The first diet break study, it had zero intention of the outcomes that were actually provided, which this study, I always laugh when I read this study and I describe this study. It's funny to me. What the researchers wanted to study in this was, why do people fail on a diet? Why is it so hard for them when they fail to get back on the dieting horse and continue to diet? So they designed a study that purposefully caused them to fail on their diet. And what they were really interested in was studying what happened right after that period. Like, hey, once we tell you to go back on the diet, why do you struggle with this? That's what they were trying to study in this. So this was people, males and females, that had obesity or that were overweight. And again, their goal was adherence. when you fail a diet, and the assumption was everybody's going to stop following a diet at some point. So they'd put all of these subjects on a diet, and as we're going to see on the next slide, there were different diet failure groups, or essentially diet breaks. But what they said was, we're going to define a list of foods, and we're going to call them the forbidden foods, which already I want these foods if they're forbidden. That's how most of us work. But they said, when you are dieting, you may not eat from this list of 13 forbidden foods. And these are like your typical like high fat, high sugar foods, processed foods. I have one here: cheeseburgers, pastries, cakes, things like that, potato chips. And while they were on their diets, they said, you cannot eat from this. But during these diet breaks, which they used to induce a scenario that mimicked failing a diet, that's what they did. So here we have the three groups. The top group, they dieted for 20 straight weeks, and they were forced to eat a low-calorie diet, or they were instructed to. So they were told, eat a low-calorie diet and do not eat any of these forbidden foods. The other two groups were also given the same dieting instructions, and you can see here, if they were in these black weeks, they said you cannot eat from these foods and you have to be in a caloric deficit. But during this diet break, so we have a 6-week diet break in what I call the long diet break group. During these 6 weeks, they said, stop dieting and eat from the list of 13 foods. And we want you to go back to whatever physical activity you were doing before the study started. So they had them do a little bit. I think it was about 150 minutes per week of aerobic exercise. And then the last group, they also had 6 weeks of diet breaks. But this, instead of being 6 consecutive weeks, it was 2 weeks, and then later on 2 weeks, and then later on 2 weeks. And again, their intention was, we want to quickly induce failure because everybody fails on a diet, and we want to see what happens when you try to go back on the diet, because we know, or they thought they knew, you're not going to be able to get back on the diet after stopping and eating all these foods. So here's the results from the study. And unfortunately, we don't have body composition data. I went in and tried to get some of that. But if you look at just look at the left to the right, what we see is essentially no differences in the amount of weight that was lost over these studies. The very bottom figure was the group that dieted for 20 straight weeks. They never stopped dieting. The two bars above, the two figures, are the two line graphs above, those were both of the diet break groups. So remember, the researchers were saying, or what they anticipated was, everybody's going to gain weight after the diet breaks or during the diet breaks. And then when that happens, that's what we really want to study. But their results did not match their expectations. What the results indicated was, to their surprise, they lost just as much weight. And not only did they lose weight, when they went back on the diet, which the researchers thought they wouldn't be able to do, they went back on their diets with no problem. So here's the most powerful way to look at this data. The bottom figure dieted for 20 straight weeks. The other two groups dieted for only 70% of that. They only dieted for 14 weeks. And statistically, they had the same weight loss outcomes. So this was a big, or it was very eye-opening to these researchers. And it really didn't catch on as a diet break type of study. Here real quick, you can just see the differences in weight loss, but effectively no differences in overall weight loss. So the authors, and let me also say, I love this research group, because a lot of scientists would not, they wouldn't change their course. They would somehow force their premonition or their theories on the discussion and on the results. And to these researchers' credit, they said, okay, we wanted to study this. That clearly didn't happen. So let's take the data and follow it to the conclusions that we can draw. So I love that they did this. So what they concluded was that prescribed breaks, so taking a break from a diet, will have no negative impact on weight loss. And again, this was never shown before, and even to this day, it's still quite surprising. If I can only diet 70% of somebody else and get the same results. And the other thing that they make a very practical application here too is, let's say you're going to diet, but you're going to go on vacation or there's holidays coming up. Maybe use those types of time frames to use a diet break. And I think that's a brilliant strategy. Real quick, a lot of us are into fitness. We have to appreciate these subjects were not athletes. They weren't fit individuals. So we got to be careful about how we're extrapolating this to people that are in fitness, which we'll do that later. All right, here's when we talk about diet breaks, just kind of like this study did, or what they intended to do, you'll often see an argument raised against diet breaks, which is this, and this is just a social media post that I found. If you tell somebody to go on a diet break and they get lax, or they let up on their diets, it can be very hard for them to then flip the switch and go back on their diets. And I just want to say now, and I'll make this point later, there's no evidence of that in the scientific literature. Now, that doesn't mean it doesn't exist on an individual basis. In fact, I would assume that it does. But people making blanket statements, I would just ask, show me where that exists in the scientific literature. Show me in the diet break research that subjects were not able to go back on the diet without any difficulty. And you can't, because it doesn't exist. All right, so now I tried to find an image where the world was turned upside down. And this study, famously called the Matador study, in my world of weight loss at the time this was published, turned the dieting world upside down. So much so that this really impacted the bodybuilding, and to this day continues to impact how bodybuilders will often approach their contest preparation. So in this study, we have males with obesity, and the purpose of this study, this was a defined diet break study, unlike the other one that found it through just happenstance. And the rationale was, hey, we think that when people diet, they become less efficient, just like I presented at the beginning of my talk. And is it possible that diet breaks prevent this, so that when people take a break and they go back on a diet, their body is more responsive during those early weeks after a diet break? So here's the two groups. The top group did not take any diet breaks. So if you look at that blue shaded area, that was 16 weeks of just straight dieting, week after week after week. And the extent of their caloric deficit was about 33%. The other group, the diet break group, also dieted for 16 weeks, but it was not consecutive. They dieted for 2, then took a 2-week diet break where they went back to their maintenance calories. So 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off, 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off. And the question was, does this cause more weight loss over time? Now, the one obvious caveat here is, if you're going to keep adding in diet breaks, that adds the length of the intervention, which I would say is about 30 weeks, 31 weeks, versus half that time in the group that's not taking any diet breaks. Here were the results of this study. The group that took diet breaks lost significantly more body weight during 16 weeks of actual dieting. So both groups lost weight, but as you can see here, the diet break group, the longer into the study that they dieted, the more efficient they were, the more body weight they lost with each cycle of dieting. So this is a perfect example of weight loss efficiency. Here's the body composition data. So essentially, They both maintained their lean body mass at about the same rate, which that's not unexpected. This was not a weightlifting study. But the subjects on the diet break, they lost 50% more body fat. They also maintained their resting metabolic rate better when adjusted for body composition, for lean and fat adipose tissue. So this study published these results, and it had a massive effect on the industry, the weight loss industry, in terms of weight loss coaches and how they were designing weight loss programs for clients, which continues to this day. I want to look at something here. A fear that a lot of people have about diet breaks is, and this is not in the research, this is just working with clients, they're very scared of taking a diet break because they feel like, hey, I've been working hard on dieting, and now I'm going to take this break and I'm going to gain all this weight back. Well, this study, and I'll give you some other ones in a moment, this study doesn't report that. If you look here, it wasn't until the very end of the study that when the subjects were taking their 2-week diet breaks, that they actually gained any amount of body weight. And it's also important to note that when the subjects are taking a diet break, they're not allowed, they weren't given ad libitum food intake. They were still told or instructed, don't consume more than what you were consuming at your maintenance levels. So it is not an ad libitum or like going to a buffet and eating anything they want. So where does this leave us so far? Well, the 2 studies that we looked at so far seems to suggest, or I would say clearly suggest, that diet breaks have a lot of potential. But I live in a world where a lot of my research is focused on people who are fit. So this was my interest. And what I want to do now is summarize 2 studies that took this diet break concept and applied it to a fit population, specifically a resistance training population. So there's this study, and then my lab did a study in resistance trained females. So let's see where this concept, if it's applied to people embracing a fitness lifestyle, what were the outcomes there? So this is an Australian study, and you'll see a similar design as the Matador study, but instead of a 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off diet to diet break ratio, what they had their diet break subjects do was diet 3 weeks on and then a 1-week diet break, and then 3 weeks of dieting and then a 1-week diet break, 3 weeks of dieting and then a final 1-week diet break, and then 3 more weeks of dieting. So what does this mean? It means 12 weeks of total dieting, 12 weeks of being in a caloric deficit. And the main difference between the 2 groups here is 12 weeks in a row or 12 weeks with 1-week breaks put throughout the intervention. So we have resistance trained males and females in this study. The caloric deficits were, I would say, on the very high end of moderate, if not aggressive. It was about a 35, let's just say a 33% caloric deficit. And now we're getting into some good stuff. These researchers know how to maintain lean mass, unlike the general weight loss research that doesn't really care about that, at least not until recently. So what they did, they had their subjects resistance train, and they gave them high amounts of protein during this diet. So these are all the low-hanging fruit things we do to maintain muscle mass. So before I share the results here, I just want to tell you, I'm giving you the results after 12 weeks of dieting. Now, in the diet break group, that was actually 15 weeks long because we have to account for the 3 weeks of diet breaks. You can also look at this. You can look at this multiple ways, and the data that I'm going to share, I'm not cherry picking anything. I think the study's open access. Essentially, what I'm going to tell you, regardless of how you look at this data, there were no differences. The diet break group did not lose more fat, did not lose more body weight, did not maintain lean mass better. There was statistically no differences between the two groups. So this was now a shift. The Matador study, big differences in the amount of fat loss. Not so in this first resistance training study. And if you look here, fat-free mass, resting metabolic rate, yeah, they lost, but not a lot. The other thing that they did, besides the physiological and body composition outcomes, was the researchers also looked at some psychological components of hunger or appetite. And this is intriguing, and I'm going to say this is very important because I'm going to come back to this later. What they realized with the group that did not take diet breaks, so the continuous groups, they reported a significantly higher hunger and desire to eat level. I'm going to come back to this later, but remember that. No physiological differences, but subjective responses to appetite/hunger variables were significantly different. So here's what their conclusions were. Essentially, if you need to lose weight quickly, a diet break strategy is probably not a good choice. But if there's no hurry to lose body weight, body fat, then possibly diet breaks are definitely not going to be harmful. But we also have to consider you might be hungrier if you don't take diet breaks, and you're going to have a higher drive to eat. All right, so that takes me to my study, or the study that we did in my research lab. We published this last year, 2023. And this was in resistance trained females. And what we did was we had one group diet for 6 consecutive weeks. We had another group diet for 2 weeks, and then they took a 1-week diet break. Then they dieted for 2 more weeks, and then took a second and final diet break, and then a final 2 weeks of dieting. So what we'll see here is a very similar global intervention. The dieting weeks were standard. Everybody dieted for 6 weeks, but it took the diet break group 8 weeks to get there because of these 2 1-week diet breaks. Just highlighting here, resistance-trained females in this study. They were instructed to reduce their calories by 25%, and we also gave them a relatively high protein intake, about 1.8 grams per kg. And the other thing, and this is the first time this has ever been done in this space, we supervised all of their workouts. So that the Australian study, they had no idea that what they were adhering to with their workouts other than logs, but we supervised this in my lab for the entire duration of the study. So what did we find? Very similar outcomes to the Australian study. No statistically significant differences in fat or lean body mass changes. So there was not this big advantage to diet breaks that we saw in the Matador study. Something else we did was we put a lot of emphasis on what actually happens to body weight during these diet breaks. So if you look here, every bar you see is a female subject. And remember, they had 2 diet breaks. And the reason we wanted to put so much attention on this, and again, we spent like $1,000 on scales to have them so they could go home and weigh themselves every day. The reason we did this was because we wanted to know if taking these diet breaks, does it cause weight gain, or is that something that is an unjustified fear? Well, if you look here, look at the distribution. Some of these subjects gained body weight on the left-hand side, but some of them actually lost body weight. Overall, we're looking at about 1/3 of a pound of a gain on average. Look at the second week. We see a pretty similar outcome. Some subjects gained, some subjects lost during a period of time where they're increasing their calories albeit back to maintenance levels. So this was about a half a pound. So if I'll step out of the research realm for a second, when I counsel coaches, so I have a large network of weight loss coaches that I continually have contact with for two reasons, by the way. One, I like to just teach them what I'm learning in my lab. And two, it makes me such a better researcher. If I know what they're doing, and by the way, everything I do is motivated by what these practitioners and these professional fitness people do. And then I just come along years after they've been doing it and say, let's validate this. So diet breaks is nothing that I pioneered. I'm just, okay, I know that fitness professionals are doing this. Let me validate it. So for those of you that are going to go into academia, I would always strongly advocate, don't just live in your academic bubble. Make sure that you develop relationships, and I mean close relationships with people doing the work, because it refines your mind as a researcher. It will help you ask better research questions. And it's just practical. It gives you a much better perspective on real world applications. So when I talk to my coaches that are in my network, I say, here's how I would communicate with a client about a diet break. I would say, hey, if you do this, what will happen is you could gain some weight during your week or two of a diet break, but you could also lose weight. But what I can tell you from the evidence, there is no harm, regardless of what happens during this week, whether you gain some or you lose some. At the end of our diet intervention, the end of our time together, you will not be in a worse off situation, because that we have no evidence that exists. All right, we also looked at some psychological variables. And by the way, this slide is me telling you there's something, a little bit of an undercurrent happening here with diet breaks that most people don't care about, but I mentioned it earlier. Now I'm going back to it. So we also looked at some psychological variables like the Australian group did. And we looked at the 3-factor eating inventory as part of our study. And what we found, and I'm going to explain this, we found one significant difference in this concept known as disinhibition. So what is disinhibition? And again, this is a dieting term. Disinhibition is a lack of control of overeating, or it's a tendency to lose control and overeat. So we also can categorize this or conceptualize this. This is particularly true in a stressful situation, or when people have access to appetizing foods, or what I have here, lots of tasty food. So disinhibition means I don't really care, I'm just going to eat. And it's a lack of control, it's a lack of discipline. And this happens typically when stress levels go up, if you've ever heard of stress eaters, or if I always think of if you're at a holiday party, a Christmas party, and there's a lot of food around, people that are more likely to experience disinhibition in those types of environments. So what we found, and by the way, what you want, you don't want disinhibition scores to go up if you're trying to lose body fat. That implies that you are more likely to binge eat or overeat. So what you want is disinhibition scores to go down. And we found that in our diet break group, that's exactly what happened. And this was our one statistic. This was the only statistically significant finding that we reported and that we observed and reported in our study. The subjects that did not take diet breaks, their disinhibition scores went up over time. The subjects that did have diet breaks, their disinhibition scores went down over time. Now, remember that earlier study? I said I was going to come back to it. They found very similar psychological subjective appetite scores. Hunger went up and the desire to eat went up. So here's what I think is happening. If you are never able to take a diet break, what this data suggests is you're going to be more hungry, you're going to have a stronger desire to eat, you're going to have higher disinhibition. And in my opinion, if these studies were conducted for a long enough period of time, there we would, in the Australian and my study, and that's one of the big weaknesses of my study, it was only 6 weeks. So there wasn't enough time to see maybe a delineation in fat loss. But what I think is happening, or what would happen, is this hunger, you can beat hunger for a period of time, but you can't beat hunger for long periods of time. So this data in both of these resistance training studies suggests to me, if the intervention or the diet is prescribed for long periods of time, we would start to see the diet break group have significant improvements. And that's what we did see in the Matador study. Remember, that was 16 weeks or 4 months of dieting. Related to this, I'm going to tell you something which is fascinating. And I encourage you to just check me on this. Find any published weight loss study, and I'll say in the history of the human race, find any weight loss study that was a 12-month intervention. I won't even give you my library. I'll just find any of them. And what you're going to see is an eerily similar outcome in almost every single one. For the first 6 months, you're going to see weight loss, and around the 6-month mark to the 12-month mark, you're going to see weight gain. Again, test me on this, find a study, email me if you say, hey, it didn't happen in this one. It happens in most, and it's crazy how consistent that is. And there's 2 reasons why that can happen. One is, after 6 months, these weight loss subjects are having metabolic adaptation. Their metabolisms are slowing down and they just can't lose weight anymore. Or, and this is where I think, this is what I believe is happening, what happens is something that I call diet fatigue, or they just don't follow the diet anymore. So this data that I'm presenting ties into a bigger application story of, if you're going to help somebody lose weight, and your plan to help them lose weight is to diet for month after month after month with no breaks, you are essentially begging them or encouraging them to just not adhere anymore. People can't follow a diet for month after month after month. But if you give them diet breaks, what we know is that hunger will be less, drive to eat will be less, and disinhibition will be less. Those are all signs or symptoms of being able to adhere to a diet longer. If we go back to the Matador study, I am convinced that the reason there was such significant differences in fat loss was not because of that a diet break's magic ability to maintain metabolism, but rather I believe it was because the subjects they simply followed the diet that was prescribed to them. When they were able to take breaks, and then when they were told to go back on the diet, they were able to do so. The subjects that didn't get breaks, they just stopped following the diet as closely as what was prescribed to them. I know Dr. Ormsby heard me speak about this before when we were in Columbia together, but real quick, I did a personal case study on myself where I wanted to lose 10% of my body weight. Here's the data for me. This took almost a year. And my approach was to take consistent diet breaks and something else I'm going to call diet refeeds. And what I mean by refeeds is it's basically taking a diet break every weekend. So we know from other research that people tend to eat more food on the weekends. So I look at that and I designed a study, which I don't know if I'll share because of time, but I'll just say, to me, if we know that people have certain habits and patterns, I think it makes sense to design a diet that fits as closely as we can into their lifestyle and patterns. So a diet refeed is a approach where we have people diet Monday through Friday, fairly hard, but on the weekends, go back to maintenance calories. They typically eat more food anyway, so let's not fight that. Let's embrace it. And that's what I did here. And this, again, this is my data. This is my weight loss. So you can see it took me 37 weeks to lose, I think it was 10% of my body weight. And not quite half, but 16 out of the 37 weeks I spent not dieting. And do you see any major upticks in body weight? No, diet breaks did not hurt me at all. In fact, if you told me right now I have to diet for 37 straight weeks, I would rather put toothpicks in my eyes. This the last thing I want to do is just diet every day and with having no end in sight. It 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 would crush my spirit thinking of that. Um, Not our topic here, but that concept has also pushed my lab into looking at extreme fat loss protocols, which we have a study submitted on that one. We're currently doing another study. So maybe next year I can come back and talk about extreme fat loss diets, to which I would say historically horrible. Crash dieting is horrible, and crash dieting is horrible. But I would say that there are strategies and techniques which my lab has investigated, which, I'll be frank with you, are very effective and are only positive. When I say positive, no adverse health outcomes and no loss of lean body mass and significant amounts of fat loss in very short periods of time. So I say all of that to just make the argument. The worst thing we can do, in my opinion, if we're helping somebody lose weight, is to put them on a perpetual diet that lasts months and months without any break, because of the psychological variables that we've already looked at, what I would call diet fatigue. And that, in my opinion, does, or over time will cause metabolic adaptation or slowing down of metabolism and greater losses of muscle mass. This was just this diet, or this carbohydrate refeed study we did. I'll just show you. When we told subjects to diet Monday through Friday and then said, hey, on the weekends, go back to your maintenance calories. So think of it as like a diet break within a 7-day period. Diet 5, take a 2-day diet break. What we found in our study was and these were in resistance trained males and females, they were able to maintain significant amounts of fat-free mass in their at the end of a 7-week diet phase. So I want to have enough time to go to questions. Good, I'm there anyway. So hopefully you have some questions. If you don't, I'll ask myself questions that I think you should ask.
Thanks, Bill. That's great. They'll get talking here in a second. I want to sort of just start it out because I'm interested in the Matador study having those significant results versus the one that the Australian group and your group ran. Do you think there's anything possibly happening in the people with obesity where they're more sensitive to the appetite changes, which would drive over that period of time? If they're more sensitive to those changes in hunger that are occurring, is there any way that the break is relieving that, of course, and then if you don't get the break, they just have an increased desire to eat, which was then separating those groups more and more, as opposed to the lean group where maybe they're not quite as sensitive to the appetite changes that are occurring?
I do think that the appetite sensations that are occurring, and I can't remember. I'm a physiologist, so it's even rare that I've even done these psychological questionnaires. I never used to do them. But I think what's happening is when you take diet, and I'm trying to expand this so I can stop sharing my screen, but somehow I'm having trouble getting to the screen where I can stop sharing.
Maybe I can force it. I'll try on my end.
Yeah. So in the people in the Matador study, which investigated males with obesity, what I believe could have been happening is by taking the diet breaks that you are absolutely eliminating the negative appetite feelings that occur when you just aren't allowed to eat other foods, or you're not allowed to increase. Yeah, that was helpful. And good. Yeah, so I do think that is what happened in that study. And the subjects that didn't have the diet breaks, they had more hunger. They had more cravings for food. Now, again, I don't remember if they actually investigated that. I actually need to look at that. And because of those things, if whether it was monitored or not, caused them to just not follow the diet as much. I mean, if you look at the data, it was pretty similar early on, but as the study got longer, they started to plateau much more than the diet break group.
Yeah, that seems really. These studies are great, but I love how you apply them and how practical they are. My um, question is about what they're eating, and in your studies, I'm sure that's pretty well controlled. And you're using like people who are fit. So, do they have a typical like protein intake that's high? I know you pointed that out, but what about their carbs and fats? And what kind of basically what calorie load is maintenance, and then what are they dropping to? I think you said a percentage, but I'm curious, like for these women in your study, what were they eating in maintenance, and what were they going to for the dieting parts?
So we don't do food records or food logs, so I can never say what they're eating. Now, what we do is we spend at least 2 weeks, depending on the study, but typically 2 weeks validating maintenance calories or energy balance. And we do that by saying, first of all, educating them on how to use a macro tracking app, which, by the way, early in my career was a huge investment of time for my research team. But now, for whatever reason, most subjects, most of my students, they use macro tracking apps. So it's not near the investment that it used to be 5-10 years ago. So that's been awesome. So what we do is we say, hey, take this scale home, weigh yourself every day, track your macros, track your calories every day, put it into this, and we validate that they're not gaining or losing weight. Right now, we're doing a reverse diet study, which is essentially what happens when the diet is over type of study. And that we're doing up to a 6-week intervention. If subjects are gaining weight, then we say, hey, then we have to make an adjustment. Or if they're losing weight, we have to make an adjustment. So we invest on the front end because the caloric deficit is based on the maintenance calories that we're getting early on. And I will say this, an advantage of studying a fit population is there is not as much underreporting as you have when you study people with obesity. Now, fit people still underreport, but it is not the same extent as what you see in a sedentary population. So once we do that, then we put them on a diet. And what we typically will do is say, hey, you're going to reduce your calories by 25%, 30%. You must get this much protein, whether that's 1.6, 1.8, 2.2 grams per kg. And then for the rest of the calories, I'll just say, honestly, I could care less whether they get carbs or fat. In my opinion, it does not matter for fat loss. But we will often say, hey, for your remaining calories, we would like you to get between 60% carbs, 40% fat. So we'll give them some target, but it doesn't matter. There's no evidence that I've been able to find in the literature, and also just practically, it doesn't matter carbs or fat unless you go to extremes. If you're going to eat very low carbs, or if you're going to go very low fat, now you're having some lean tissue consequences. But so it's very protein. What we say is we prescribe a protein anchored flexible diet. So here's your calories. Make sure you get this much protein, and essentially however you want to divide up your other calories is fine.
First off, thank you so much for talking to us. So we spent a lot of time talking about like resistance training. Is there anything that says that like these diet breaks are beneficial for the endurance athlete? And if there isn't anything, is this something that's worth investigating?
So yeah, let me think about that. One, and knowing the program you're in, we want to make sure that our endurance athletes are resistance training just for resiliency of joint integrity, preventing injuries. And again, when I was young in my career, that was a very controversial statement. When I was younger, endurance training clubs, endurance focused people, they didn't lift weights. And I think that's in large part changed right now. I mean, if an endurance athlete doesn't need to lose body fat, then, and again, I know that a lot of people want to lose weight even though they don't need to. But I would say, hey, if I'm counseling an endurance athlete, do you need to lose body fat? The answer is no. Then let's focus on your performance, because dieting is not good for performance. You don't want to diet. Dieting is nobody's friend for trying to build muscle, trying to maintain muscle, and trying to maintain performance. So if an endurance athlete does need to lose body fat, the first thing I would say is, can we do this in their off season when they don't have a scholarship on the line, or their earnings aren't tied to their performance? So can we do this in an off season? And if the answer is yes, then by all means, I'm going to employ some type of diet break strategy. And even better, if they have to, if we feel like, hey, we need to lose fat and it's your in season, then let's feed them up. Let's not diet during the competition, but let's diet maybe during, the periods of time where we have more time between competitions. So I see this as a very practical strategy for athletes, for sports athletes, endurance athletes in this case.
Brilliant, Bill. I really appreciate you coming on today and speaking with us. Just so everybody in the class knows and they can share it widely, is there anywhere that you'd like them to track what you're doing, or is there anywhere they can find you that you're interested in telling us about?
Yeah, and thank you for having me. This is, again, I'm so blessed by God to be able to study this stuff and talk about it. I have an Instagram account if anybody wants to follow me there. It's Bill Campbell, PhD. It's very sports nutrition and weight loss focused. It's kind of what I do. So that's the only place that I'm active on social media.
Okay, well, I appreciate that. I'm sure they'll all be on there watching what you put out. I love seeing your content on there as well, and I'm excited for our some upcoming collaborations we've been talking about. So,
Yes, dude, I'm running into a meeting right after this. We're attacking the exercise section of the survey.
I love it. I love it. Well, we'll be in touch. Thanks again, and everyone, let's give them a round of applause.
Thank you.
Take care, Bill.
See ya.